In the winter of 1968, people in Salem were still leaving their doors unlocked. Teenagers hitchhiked between towns without thinking twice about it, and women working late shifts or shopping alone rarely felt the need to look over their shoulder. The roads around Salem cut through farmland and long stretches of dark highway, and most nights the city felt quiet in the safest possible way. Families sat down for dinner at the same time every evening. Mechanics worked in open garages with radios humming in the background. Nothing about the town suggested that someone was hunting women there. At the edge of Salem lived a quiet husband and father who blended into the background of everyday life. To neighbors, he looked ordinary. He worked with electronics, repaired vehicles in his garage, and lived with his wife and children in a modest home near farmland. People who knew him described him as shy, socially awkward, and forgettable. He wasn't the kind of man anyone remembered after passing him in a grocery store. But inside the garage attached to his home, he had created a private world no one else was allowed to enter. He installed an intercom so his wife and children had to announce themselves before walking near it. The room was cluttered with engine parts, electrical wire, tools, and shelves stacked with women's shoes and lingerie he had secretly stolen over the years. He spent hours alone there, usually late at night after everyone else had gone to sleep. To outsiders, it probably looked like a mechanic's workshop. In reality, it was becoming something much worse. The first woman who disappeared was 19-year-old Linda Slauson, a door-to-door encyclopedia saleswoman. One afternoon in January 1968, she accidentally walked onto the property after mistaking the address for a nearby house. The man was outside working in the yard when she approached him. She explained she was there for an appointment to discuss encyclopedias. Instead of correcting her, he pretended to be interested and invited her inside. Linda followed him into the basement carrying her sample books. She sat on a stool and started giving her sales presentation, while he stood nearby listening quietly. Nothing about the interaction seemed dangerous yet. It probably felt awkward more than anything else. Then, without warning, he picked up a piece of wood and struck her in the head. When she collapsed, he strangled her to death there in the basement. What happened afterward became one of the most disturbing parts of the case. Instead of panicking or immediately disposing of the body, he calmly hid Linda beneath the basement stairs. Then he asked his mother to take his daughter out for hamburgers so he could be alone in the house. Once everyone was gone, he dragged Linda's body back out and began dressing and redressing her in lingerie and high heels from his collection while photographing her. He kept returning to the body for hours. Eventually, he severed one of her feet with a hacksaw because he wanted to use it to display women's shoes. Then he weighted the rest of her body down with scrap metal and dumped it somewhere outside Salem. Linda's body was never recovered. Her family spent years wondering where she had gone. Months later, another woman disappeared. 23-year-old Jan Whitney had car trouble on Interstate 5 in November 1968. She was standing beside her broken-down Rambler with two hitchhikers she had picked up earlier when a man stopped and offered to help. He examined the vehicle and claimed he needed tools from home. The three agreed to ride with him. First, he dropped the hitchhikers off where they needed to go. Then, he drove Jan towards Salem alone. When they arrived at his house, the man parked in the driveway and went inside, supposedly to retrieve tools. But instead of coming back through the front door, he quietly circled around to the rear of the vehicle. Jan was still sitting in the passenger seat, waiting. He leaned forward from behind her and casually asked if she could explain how to tie a shoelace without using her hands. It sounded childish and strange, but harmless enough that she played along. She closed her eyes to think about it. That was when he looped a leather strap around her neck and strangled her from behind. He carried Jan's body into the garage workshop and kept her there for days. He dressed her in different outfits, photographed her repeatedly, and suspended her body from a ceiling pulley. At one point, a car accidentally crashed into the garage wall. A police officer responded to the scene and actually looked into the garage while Jan's body was hanging inside. Because of the darkness and debris, he never noticed her. In March 1969, 18-year-old chemistry student Karen Sprinker vanished while walking through a department store parking lot. The killer had initially followed another woman wearing high heels, but lost sight of her. On the way back to his car, he noticed Karen. He pulled a gun on her and forced her into his station wagon. She begged him not to hurt her during the drive home. Once inside the garage, she offered to do anything if he would let her live. He raped her, photographed her in lingerie and high heels, then tied a rope around her neck. Before killing her, he actually asked if the rope was too tight. Karen answered that it was. He then threw the rope over a ceiling beam and pulled until she died hanging from the garage ceiling. Weeks later, another woman disappeared from a shopping center parking lot. 22-year-old Linda Sally had spent the afternoon buying birthday gifts for her fiancé. As she walked back toward her vehicle carrying shopping bags, a man approached her and flashed a fake police badge. He told her she was under arrest for shoplifting. Confused and embarrassed, Linda tried explaining she had receipts for everything she bought, but the man insisted she needed to come with him. The man drove her back to his house and parked in the garage. Then something unexpected happened. As he walked Linda across the yard, the front door opened and his wife stepped onto the porch to tell him dinner was ready. The kidnapper calmly answered her from only a few feet away, while Linda stood frozen in the yard beside him. His wife had no idea there was a kidnapped woman standing there in silence. The man brought Linda back into the garage, tied her up, then casually went inside to eat dinner with his family. While he sat at the table eating, Linda managed to free herself from the bindings, but she didn't run. Maybe she was afraid he would hear her. Maybe she didn't know where to go. When he returned, she fought back desperately, scratching and kicking as he strangled her with a leather strap. By then, police were already hearing reports from women who had narrowly escaped abduction attempts around Portland and Salem. One woman fought off a heavy-set attacker in a parking garage after biting his hand so hard he fled. Another victim, a 15-year-old girl, escaped after running toward a woman working in a nearby yard. Both described a man in his 30s with glasses and thinning hair driving strange vehicles. Then, in May 1969, fishermen discovered a badly decomposed body floating in the Long Tom River. It was Linda Sally. 2 days later, another body surfaced nearby. Karen Sprinker. Both had been tied down with engine parts and electrical wire. Investigators realized immediately that the same killer was responsible. Police started tracing mechanics, electricians, and men with histories of sexual violence. Eventually, they found a college student who admitted she had recently gone on a miserable date with an older man who repeatedly joked about the murdered women found in the river. During the drive home, he had casually asked her, "How did you know I wouldn't take you to the river and strangle you?" The student agreed to call police if the man contacted her again. A week later, he did. Investigators arrested him during the arranged meeting, but at first they didn't have enough evidence to hold him. They released him while continuing surveillance. Then they searched his property. Inside the garage, they found stacks of women's shoes and underwear, engine components matching the ones used to sink the bodies, coils of copper wire identical to the bindings from the crime scenes, and dozens of Polaroid photographs. Some showed terrified women alive. Others showed dead women hanging from the ceiling pulley inside the garage. One photograph even captured the reflection of the killer holding the camera himself. The man they arrested was Jerry Brudos, the quiet husband and father from Salem, the mechanic working alone in his garage at night, the man neighbors barely noticed, the man whose wife had unknowingly called him to dinner while a kidnapped woman stood silently beside him in the yard. In the summer of 2008, long-distance Greyhound bus rides across Canada still felt routine. People carried blankets and pillows onto overnight trips, plugged wired headphones into MP3 players, and tried to sleep through endless stretches of highway cutting across the prairie provinces. Most passengers kept to themselves. Some stared quietly out at farmland rolling past the windows, while others switched buses between cities after seasonal jobs or visits with family. Nobody boarding those buses expected danger from the stranger sitting beside them. 22-year-old Tim McLean had spent the previous weeks working as a carnival barker in Edmonton. The job meant long days around rides, loud music, and crowds moving through fairgrounds late into the night. Once the fair ended, Tim boarded Greyhound bus 1170 headed back toward Winnipeg. He sat near the rear of the bus, one row ahead of the bathroom, carrying the kind of exhaustion that makes people fall asleep almost immediately during overnight travel. Friends later described him as friendly, relaxed, and easy to get along with. Earlier that same evening, another passenger boarded the bus in Erickson, Manitoba. Passengers remembered him afterward because of how unusual he looked. He was a tall man in his 40s with a shaved head, dark sunglasses, and several bags. At first, he sat quietly near the front without speaking much to anyone. Witnesses later said nothing about him immediately felt threatening. If anything, he just seemed distant and socially awkward. After the bus stopped in Brandon, though, the man suddenly got up, walked toward the rear, and sat directly beside Tim McLean. Tim barely acknowledged him before leaning against the window and falling asleep with his headphones still covering his ears. Outside, the Trans-Canada Highway had gone almost completely dark. The bus rolled through isolated stretches of Manitoba farmland, while most passengers either slept or stared quietly ahead. Then, without warning, screaming erupted from the rear seats. Passengers turned and saw the man beside Tim, stabbing him repeatedly in the neck and chest with a large knife. The attack happened so fast that several people initially froze, unable to process what they were seeing. The bus driver immediately swerved onto the shoulder and slammed to a stop while passengers rushed toward the front exit in panic. Tim appeared to wake up only seconds before the attack began. Witnesses later said he had almost no time to react. The bus driver and two male passengers initially tried running back to help him, but the attacker suddenly turned toward them, holding the knife, and chased them away. Everyone fled the bus except the attacker and Tim. Once outside, the driver locked the doors behind them to keep the man trapped inside. What happened over the next several hours became one of the most horrifying crimes in Canadian history. Passengers gathered along the roadside beside the dark highway, while traffic slowly passed nearby. Some people cried openly, others vomited into the grass or stood staring at the bus in complete shock. Inside the vehicle, the attacker continued moving calmly through the aisle while carrying out acts so disturbing that witnesses later struggled to describe them publicly. At one point, he walked toward the front of the bus, holding Tim McLean's severed head, and displayed it through the window to the terrified passengers outside. Around 8:30 that night, RCMP officers arrived to find complete chaos at the scene. A standoff immediately began because the attacker was still inside the Greyhound bus, armed with the knife. Passengers, the bus driver, and even a truck driver who had stopped nearby worked together to prevent him from escaping. The truck driver handed over a crowbar and hammer for protection, while police surrounded the bus. The driver had also activated the bus emergency immobilizer after the attacker tried driving the vehicle away, leaving the bus disabled on the side of the highway. Meanwhile, the passengers huddled together along the roadside, waiting for updates, while officers established a perimeter around the scene. By 9 p.m., police negotiators and tactical units had arrived. Officers watched through the bus windows as the attacker paced slowly up and down the aisle. Police later reported seeing him mutilating Tim's body while talking to himself. At one point, officers heard him say, "I have to stay on the bus forever." The standoff continued deep into the night. Passengers were eventually transported away for questioning, many of them still covered in blood after fleeing the attack. Several later admitted they could never ride public transportation again after witnessing what happened inside that Greyhound bus. The next morning, Greyhound representatives brought passengers to a store because all their belongings and clothes were still trapped inside the crime scene vehicle. Nearly 20 hours after the attack began, the surviving passengers finally arrived in Winnipeg, exhausted and traumatized. Around 1:30 in the morning, after nearly 5 hours alone inside the bus, the attacker suddenly tried escaping by smashing a window. Police immediately rushed forward. Officers tasered him twice, handcuffed him, and dragged him into custody beside the highway. Inside the bus, investigators recovered plastic bags containing body parts. Tim McLean's ear, tongue, and nose were later found inside the attacker's pockets. Other parts of Tim's body were never recovered, and investigators believed they had been consumed during the attack. As news spread across Canada the following morning, people struggled to understand how something so brutal could happen in front of dozens of witnesses on a public bus. At first, many assumed the attacker had to be some kind of serial killer hiding in plain sight. But investigators soon uncovered a much stranger and more tragic story. Years before the attack, the man responsible had lived what seemed like an ordinary life. He was born in Dandong, where his mother worked as a math teacher and his father as a custodian. As a child, he was reportedly sickly and developmentally delayed, learning to walk and speak much later than normal. But eventually, his health improved, and he became academically successful enough to study automotive engineering and computing at university. By the 1990s, he was working as a software engineer in Beijing and later married a woman named Anna. Friends and family later said he showed no obvious signs of mental illness during those years. In 2001, he immigrated to Canada through the Federal Skilled Worker Program. Over the following years, he worked a long list of ordinary jobs, including church maintenance work, forklift operation, janitorial work, gas station jobs, fast food restaurants, newspaper delivery, and Walmart. Co-workers consistently described him as quiet, polite, and hardworking. One pastor who employed him later said he seemed genuinely grateful just to have work, even though language barriers sometimes frustrated him. But privately, his mental health had been collapsing for years. According to psychiatrists, he became convinced he was hearing the voice of God speaking directly to him. He believed he was somehow connected to the second coming of Jesus, and that alien infiltrators were hiding among ordinary people. He wandered across Canada following what he believed were divine instructions, sometimes disappearing from home for days without explanation. Because he believed these aliens might attack him at any moment, he started carrying a buck knife for protection. It was the same knife later used on the bus. His wife later described him going days without sleeping or eating while crying uncontrollably and talking about visions nobody else could see. Friends and family repeatedly begged him to seek medical help, but he refused because he feared hospitals. At one point, police in Ontario discovered him wandering near a highway dehydrated and malnourished after he claimed God told him to follow the sun. Doctors wanted to observe him longer, but he checked himself out against medical advice. By 2008, his condition had deteriorated rapidly. He abruptly flew to China, only to return a single day later. He lost his Walmart job after an argument with another employee. Then, on July 24th, just days before the attack, he left a note for his ex-wife reading, "Don't look for me. I wish you were happy." The following day, he boarded a Greyhound bus in Edmonton, heading toward Winnipeg. During the trip, witnesses saw him sitting alone overnight on a bench beside a grocery store in Erickson, with his eyes wide open at 3 in the morning. Later that same day, he sold his laptop to a 15-year-old boy for only $60. When police later examined the laptop, they found dozens of job resumes, random photographs, military parade images, pictures of mountains, and an unsent message in which he admitted Canada was not as he expected. Then came the bus ride. During the trial, psychiatrists revealed what he believed was happening inside his mind that night. According to doctors, he became convinced Tim McLean was not actually human. In his delusional state, he believed Tim was a demon or alien disguised as a passenger, and that God was commanding him to destroy him before he himself would be killed. He later claimed he believed mutilating Tim's body was necessary to prevent him from somehow coming back to life. When he finally appeared in court, charged with second-degree murder, the only words he reportedly said were, "Please kill me." Psychiatrists unanimously concluded he was suffering from severe schizophrenia during the attack and could not understand reality at the time of the killing. The court ultimately ruled that the man was not criminally responsible because of mental disorder and committed him to a psychiatric facility instead of prison. The quiet man wearing sunglasses who boarded that Greyhound bus in Manitoba was Vincent Lee, not a hidden serial killer, but a severely schizophrenic man in the middle of a catastrophic psychotic break that nobody around him fully understood until it was far too late. In the summer of 1912, the town of Villisca was the kind of place where everyone recognized each other by sight. Families left doors unlocked, children walked between houses after dark, and most people ended their evenings on front porches, listening to insects and distant train whistles drifting across farmland. Villisca only had a few thousand residents, and life there moved slowly enough that unusual events rarely stayed secret for long. When something happened in town, everyone heard about it by morning. The Moore family was one of the best-known families in Villisca. Josiah Moore owned a successful business. Sarah Moore helped organize church events, and their 4 children were familiar faces around town. Friends and neighbors described them as well-liked, stable, and deeply involved in the community. On June 9, 1912, the family spent the evening attending the Presbyterian Church's Children's Day program, which Sarah had helped coordinate. Their daughter Mary Catherine had invited 2 sisters from town, Ina and Lena Stillinger, to spend the night afterward. That evening felt completely ordinary. After the church event ended around 9:30 p.m., the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters walked home together through the quiet streets of Villisca. They arrived at the Moore house sometime between 9:45 and 10 o'clock that night. The children likely changed into sleepwear while the adults settled the house down for bed. Outside, the town gradually went dark as porch lamps disappeared one by one across the neighborhood. Sometime after midnight, someone entered the Moore home carrying an axe. Investigators later believed the killer may have been inside the house before the family even returned from church. Some reports suggested spent cigarettes had been discovered in the attic, leading to theories that the murderer hid there quietly for hours, waiting for everyone to fall asleep. Another theory suggested the killer entered through an unlocked door sometime during the night. Either way, nobody inside the home appeared to hear him moving through the house. The killer began upstairs in the master bedroom where Josiah and Sarah Moore slept. Josiah received the most violent attack of anyone in the house. Investigators later said the wounds to his face were so severe that his eyes had been completely destroyed. A gouge mark in the bedroom ceiling suggested the killer accidentally struck the ceiling while swinging the axe downward. Unlike the others, Josiah was attacked using the blade of the axe rather than the blunt end. After killing the parents, the murderer moved room to room through the small farmhouse. The 4 Moore children, Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, and Paul, were killed next in their beds. Investigators were later stunned by how little noise seemed to have occurred during the murders. The old farmhouse floors creaked loudly when walked across, yet nobody nearby reported hearing screams or disturbances that night. Some newspapers later speculated the family may have unknowingly consumed milk or cocoa mixed with sedatives before bed, although toxicology testing wasn't routine in 1912 and the theory was never proven. After killing the children, the murderer returned to the master bedroom and struck Josiah and Sarah again. Investigators later noticed a shoe near the bed had tipped over and filled with blood from the second attack. Then the killer moved downstairs into the guest bedroom where Ina and Lena Stillinger were sleeping. Unlike the others, investigators believed Lena Stillinger may have awakened during the attack. She was found lying crosswise on the bed with a defensive wound on her arm, suggesting she tried to fight back. Her body had also been moved afterward, and her clothing was disturbed in ways investigators found deeply unsettling. Law enforcement initially feared the killer may have sexually assaulted her although later examinations found no evidence confirming that. Then the crime scene became even stranger. Every mirror inside the house had been covered with blankets, clothing, or fabric pulled from dressers. Windows were also covered in places. Downstairs, investigators found a plate of untouched food and a bowl of bloody water sitting in the kitchen. Nearby was a strange detail nobody could explain: a slab of bacon removed from the icebox and placed beside the axe used in the murders. The next morning, around 7 a.m., neighbor Mary Peckham noticed something unusual. The Moore family hadn't come outside to do their morning chores. At first, the silence probably just seemed odd. Peckham knocked on the door, but nobody answered. She tried opening it and realized it was locked. Growing concerned, she let the family's chickens out herself before contacting Josiah's brother, Ross Moore. Ross arrived carrying a copy of the house key and entered through the front door while Mary waited nervously outside on the porch. Seconds later, Ross opened the downstairs guest bedroom door and discovered the bodies of Ina and Lena Stillinger lying on the bed. He immediately backed away and told Mary Peckham to call the town's primary peace officer, Henry Hank Horton. Horton arrived shortly afterward and searched the rest of the home, uncovering one horrifying scene after another as he moved through the house room by room. News spread across Villisca almost instantly. At around 8:40 that morning, the town telephone operator issued an all-call alert notifying residents about the murders. Within minutes, crowds flooded toward the Moore house. Instead of securing the crime scene, townspeople walked freely through the home, staring at the bodies and touching evidence. Some even handled the murder weapon itself. According to reports, pieces of Josiah Moore's skull were stolen as souvenirs by people entering the house. The sheriff struggled for hours to regain control. A local druggist arrived hoping to photograph the crime scene, but was turned away because officials considered photographs too ghoulish. Meanwhile, more and more curious residents continued entering the house. By the time the National Guard finally established a perimeter around 10:30 a.m., the crime scene had already been catastrophically contaminated. The bodies remained inside the house nearly an entire day after the murders. The coroner, Dr. Lindquist, spent hours arguing with officials while people continued interfering with the investigation. The home eventually became so overwhelmed with activity that it was late at night before permission was finally given to move the victims. The local fire station was converted into a temporary morgue, and it was close to 2 o'clock in the morning before all 8 bodies had finally been transported out of the house. Investigators quickly realized how strange the murders actually were. An imprint in hay near the barn suggested someone may have watched the Moore family through a knothole for some time before entering the house. A gas lamp upstairs had its chimney removed and wick turned down low enough to create only a faint light. Investigators also discovered a broken keychain fragment inside the home that didn't belong to anyone in the family. Then came the suspects. Over the years, nearly everyone connected to the town fell under suspicion at some point. One man reportedly slept with an axe beside his bed and became obsessed with the murders. Another suspect had attended the same church event as the Moore family the night before the killings. Witnesses described him as deeply peculiar and mentally unstable. He later wrote disturbing letters to investigators describing the murders in unusual detail and eventually even confessed, but the confession was considered unreliable and juries refused to convict him. Other theories pointed toward business rivalries. Some people believed a local businessman arranged the murders because Josiah Moore had opened a competing store and reportedly damaged his business. Rumors also spread that Josiah had an affair with the man's daughter-in-law, though no evidence ever confirmed it. Another theory claimed a violent drifter committed the murders as part of a string of axe killings happening across multiple states during that time period. Investigators eventually noticed disturbing similarities between Villisca and other unsolved axe murders around the country. In several cases, entire families had been killed in their beds late at night, using axes found inside the homes themselves. Windows had been covered, mirrors had been hidden, lamps were left burning dimly. Victims' heads were covered with blankets afterward. some investigators began to suspect the Villisca murders weren't an isolated crime at all, but part of a larger series committed by a traveling serial killer newspapers nicknamed Billy the Axeman. But despite years of investigations, arrests, confessions, theories, and public accusations, nobody was ever convicted for the murders inside the Moore house. The case slowly transformed from a local tragedy into one of the most infamous unsolved murder mysteries in American history. Eventually, the Moore home itself became more famous than any suspect attached to the investigation. Decades later, the house was restored to look almost exactly as it did in 1912. Visitors now walk through the same narrow rooms where the Moore family slept that night. The mirrors still sit in roughly the same places. The small bedrooms still feel cramped and unnaturally quiet. And because the murders were never solved, the house carries a feeling that something inside the story was left unfinished. More than a century later, nobody knows who walked through that farmhouse carrying the axe. Alright guys, that will be it for today. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss next week's upload. I drop new stories every week, so there's always something coming. I'll see you in the next one.